The bustling atmosphere of JFK International Airport filled the air with a mix of excited chatter, rolling suitcases, and overhead announcements. It was just another busy Friday evening, with travelers rushing to their destinations, families reuniting, and airport staff going about their routine duties. Among the crowd stood a tall, well-dressed man in his early 40s, his crisp navy suit showing slight wrinkles from the 6-hour flight. He had just returned from delivering a groundbreaking presentation at an international medical conference in London. Despite his exhaustion, his eyes remained alert as he waited patiently at the baggage claim, occasionally checking his phone to respond to urgent patient updates from his hospital. As a top neurosurgeon who had performed over 1,000 successful surgeries, he was used to maintaining his composure in stressful situations. His colleagues often joked that he had nerves of steel, but today, all he wanted was to grab his suitcase and head home to his family. He hadn't seen them for a week, and his youngest had just lost their first tooth, a moment he had to witness through a video call. The baggage carousel creaked to life, and suitcases of various sizes and colors began their journey around the belt. He adjusted his glasses, stepping closer to get a better view. After 15 minutes of waiting, he spotted a black leather suitcase that looked exactly like his. The silver warranty tag he'd attached to the handle glinted under the fluorescent lights, confirming his ownership. Just as he reached for the handle, purposefully avoiding bumping into the tired-looking mother struggling with her toddler next to him, a sharp voice cut through the general airport noise. "Hey, stop right there." The commanding tone made several heads turn. A security guard was quickly approaching, his hand raised in a stopping gesture. Behind him, a man in a gray business suit was pointing accusingly, his face red with anger. Our neurosurgeon froze, his hand still extended toward the suitcase. He noticed how the atmosphere around him suddenly shifted. The same people who had been mindlessly scrolling through their phones moments ago were now watching intently. The mother next to him pulled her child closer, taking a step away. "Step away from the luggage, sir," the security guard demanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The neurosurgeon's heart began to race, not from fear, but from the familiar sting of recognition. He had been here before, in different places, different situations, but always the same assumption. He straightened his back, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. His mind raced through the contents of his suitcase, his conference presentation materials, the small gifts he'd bought for his kids from London, and most importantly, the hospital documentation he needed for tomorrow's board meeting. He couldn't afford to lose that suitcase, but he also knew that one wrong move, one sign of frustration, could make this situation much worse. The businessman behind the security guard was now walking forward, his finger still pointing. "That's my suitcase. I watched him try to steal it. I have the same exact bag, and I know mine just came off the carousel." More security guards were approaching now. The neurosurgeon took a deep breath, reminding himself of who he was, not just his profession, but his character. He had handled delicate surgeries that had saved countless lives. Surely he could handle this moment with the same precision and patience. Little did anyone know that this ordinary scene at an airport baggage claim was about to turn into something that would make headlines across the country. But for now, he stood there, surrounded by judging eyes and hostile faces, about to face an all too familiar struggle that had nothing to do with the suitcase in question. The next few moments unfolded like a scene from a movie, except this was painfully real. The security guard positioned himself between our neurosurgeon and the suitcase, while the angry businessman continued making a scene. People had their phones out now, some openly recording, others pretending to text while secretly capturing the drama. "Sir, I'll need to see your boarding pass and ID," the security guard demanded. His hand rested on his radio, ready to call for backup at any moment. The neurosurgeon reached slowly into his jacket pocket, hyper-aware of how every movement was being watched and judged. "Of course," he replied calmly, though his heart was pounding. "But I want to point out that this is my suitcase. I can prove it by describing every item inside." He pulled out his passport and boarding pass, handling them with the same steady hands that had performed intricate brain surgeries just days before. The businessman scoffed loudly. "Yeah, right. I bet you've been watching me since I got off the plane. That's my bag. I paid $500 for it at Nordstrom last month." His voice carried across the baggage claim area, drawing even more attention. A small crowd had gathered now, keeping what they thought was a safe distance. The neurosurgeon noticed how some parents were ushering their children away, how elderly couples were whispering behind their hands, and how a group of teenagers were live streaming the whole thing. 2 more security guards joined the scene. The first guard was examining the ID and boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny, flipping them over multiple times as if expecting to find them fake. The businessman took this opportunity to step closer, his confidence growing with the additional security presence. "I want him arrested," the businessman demanded, straightening his gray suit jacket. "This is attempted theft. I travel every week for business, and I'm sick of people thinking they can just take whatever they want." The neurosurgeon felt his phone vibrating in his pocket, probably his wife wondering why he hadn't called to say he'd landed. He wanted to reach for it, to let her know he was okay, but he knew better than to make any sudden movements right now. "Sir," he addressed the head security guard, keeping his voice steady and professional, "I understand you're doing your job, but this is a simple misunderstanding. The suitcase is mine. If you look at the warranty tag, you'll see the date of purchase. I also have photos on my phone of the suitcase from when I bought it." The businessman interrupted again, his face getting redder by the minute. Anyone can put a tag on a bag. Listen to how he talks, trying to sound all educated. "I know what I saw." One of the security guards, a younger one who seemed slightly uncomfortable with the situation, spoke up. "Sir, we'll need you to step aside for additional questioning. Standard procedure in these cases." The neurosurgeon noticed how the guard said, "these cases." The subtle implication wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years building his career, saving lives, breaking barriers in his field, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal because someone saw him, made assumptions, and decided he didn't have the right to own an expensive suitcase. The crowd around them had grown larger, and he could hear snippets of their conversations. Some were sympathetic, others suspicious. A young woman in scrubs was looking at him intently, her forehead wrinkled in concentration as if trying to remember something. Just then, another black leather suitcase, identical to the one in question, came rolling down the baggage carousel. The neurosurgeon spotted it first, but he waited. He knew that what was about to unfold would do more than just prove his innocence. It would make everyone present confront their own biases, even if they weren't ready to admit them. The scene was set for a revelation that would make everyone rethink their assumptions, but for now, he stood there, surrounded by security, watched by dozens of strangers, about to teach them all an unexpected lesson in humility and prejudice. The humiliation reached its peak as the security team led our neurosurgeon to a small room near the baggage claim area. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the already tense situation feel even more uncomfortable. They asked him to empty his pockets, placing his belongings one by one on a cold metal table. Out came his wallet, filled with hospital ID cards and medical licenses. His phone kept lighting up with messages, probably his worried family wondering why he wasn't home yet. His house keys with a small keychain his daughter had made him. A crumpled receipt from the airport coffee shop in London. A half-empty pack of mints. "And your bags, sir," the senior guard instructed, pointing to his carry-on briefcase. The neurosurgeon unzipped it carefully, revealing a laptop covered in hospital security stickers, medical journals, and a stack of papers about a groundbreaking surgical technique he just presented in London. The younger guard's eyes widened slightly as he noticed the medical documents, but the senior officer remained unmoved. "We'll need to verify all of this," he said, his tone suggesting he'd heard every excuse in the book. The businessman, who had insisted on being present, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking smug. Just then, there was a commotion outside. The young woman in scrubs who had been watching earlier was trying to get past another security guard. "Wait, you're making a huge mistake," she called out, her voice urgent and clear. "I know who he is." The senior guard tried to wave her away, but she persisted. "I was at the International Medical Conference in London. He was the keynote speaker. He's revolutionized pediatric brain surgery. I have proof." She fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking with a mix of nervousness and determination. The businessman's smug expression began to falter as the nurse pulled up a video from the conference. There on her screen was the same man they had been detaining, standing on a stage in front of hundreds of medical professionals, explaining a surgical technique that had saved countless children's lives. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The younger guard stepped back, looking embarrassed. The senior officer's stern expression cracked slightly. The businessman's face had turned from red to pale as he realized his mistake. But it wasn't over yet. Another security guard burst into the room, slightly out of breath. "Sir," he addressed the businessman, "we found another black suitcase on the carousel. Exactly like this one. Would you like to check if it's yours?" The businessman's eyes darted between the suitcase they'd been fighting over and the door. His confident posture crumbled as the reality of his mistake dawned on him. Without a word, he hurried out to check the other suitcase, leaving behind an awkward silence. The neurosurgeon stood there, his possessions still spread out on the table like evidence in a crime that never happened. He looked at each person in the room, not with anger or resentment, but with the same steady gaze he used when explaining complicated procedures to worried parents. "You know," he said quietly, picking up his hospital ID, "every day in surgery, I make decisions that can change lives. I can't afford to make assumptions. I have to look at the facts, check everything carefully, treat each case with respect." He paused, letting his words sink in. Maybe that's something we could all learn from. The senior guard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. The young nurse was still standing in the doorway, her phone displaying more photos from the conference. The neurosurgeon receiving awards, speaking with world-renowned doctors, demonstrating techniques that had changed modern medicine. The evidence of who he really was, not just his profession, but his character, was overwhelming. Yet something more important was happening in that small airport security room. It wasn't just about proving his identity anymore. It was about exposing the invisible biases that had led them all to this moment. And as he started gathering his belongings, he knew the story was far from over. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments, and there was still more to learn from this one. The young nurse's hands were still shaking as she stepped fully into the security room, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "I'd watched your presentation 3 times on the conference livestream," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Your technique for reducing brain swelling in children. It saved my little cousin last month. The doctors used your method." The security guards shifted uncomfortably, their earlier certainty crumbling as more medical professionals began gathering outside the room. Word had spread through the airport, and other doctors and nurses who had attended the conference virtually were now coming forward, their phones displaying similar videos and presentations. "I can't believe this is happening," one doctor in a white coat said, having rushed down from the airport's medical office. "Do you realize who you're detaining? His research is taught in every medical school in the country. I have his papers on my desk right now." The neurosurgeon remained calm, though his eyes softened at the young nurse's story about her cousin. This was why he did his work, not for recognition, not for praise, but for the lives he could help save, directly or indirectly, through his research and techniques. The businessman returned, head down, dragging the identical suitcase he'd found on the carousel. His face was ashen as he mumbled, "I found mine. It looks exactly the same." He couldn't meet anyone's eyes, the weight of his actions visible in his slumped shoulders. The senior security guard cleared his throat. "Sir, we apologize for this unfortunate incident." His words seemed inadequate in the face of what had just transpired. The younger guard was already helping to gather the neurosurgeon's scattered belongings from the metal table, handling each item with newfound respect. But the neurosurgeon wasn't done. He turned to address everyone in and around the room. "You know what's interesting?" he said, his voice carrying the same steady tone he used in the operating room. "In surgery, we have a protocol called time out. Before every procedure, no matter how certain we are, we stop and verify everything. The patient's identity, the procedure, the site. We do this because assumptions can be deadly." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Today, assumptions were made about me the moment I reached for my suitcase. Not because of anything I did, but because of what I look like. How many other travelers have faced this same situation without having a room full of doctors to speak up for them?" The crowd outside had grown larger. Phones were recording, but now they weren't capturing a suspected theft. They were documenting a powerful moment of truth. The young nurse wiped tears from her eyes as she showed more conference attendees the videos on her phone. The businessman, still holding his identical suitcase, finally found his voice. I was wrong. Completely wrong. I just saw, I assumed." He struggled to finish his sentence, the reality of his prejudice finally hitting him. "The interesting thing about bias," the neurosurgeon continued, picking up his conference materials, "is that it affects our vision more than any medical condition I've studied. It makes us see what we expect to see, not what's actually there." A mother in the crowd called out, "My son wants to be a doctor. Would you mind if you took a picture with you?" Her voice cracked with emotion, understanding the deeper impact of this moment. The atmosphere had transformed completely. What had started as a humiliating detention was becoming something else, a teachable moment that would stay with everyone present. The security guards were already discussing changes they needed to make to their procedures. The businessman was quietly asking the senior guard for the neurosurgeon's contact information, wanting to make a formal apology. And through it all, the neurosurgeon maintained his dignity, turning what could have been just another story of prejudice into a powerful lesson about assumptions, respect, and the importance of looking beyond our first impressions. The same hands that had been forced to empty their pockets would tomorrow save another life in the operating room, proving yet again that character and capability have nothing to do with appearance. The truth hit like a tidal wave, washing away all the previous assumptions and prejudices. The young nurse had pulled up the hospital's website on her phone, showing everyone that the man they had accused was not just any doctor. He was the newly appointed chief of surgery at one of the nation's most prestigious hospitals. "Look," she said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and anger. "He's revolutionized pediatric brain surgery. Last month, he performed a surgery that other doctors said it was impossible. He saved a 5-year-old girl who had been given no hope." The businessman, still clutching his identical suitcase, looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. His earlier accusations now seemed not just wrong, but painfully ignorant. The website showed photos of the neurosurgeon receiving awards, leading teams of doctors, and most importantly, bringing hope to families who had none. "I performed that surgery just before flying to London," the neurosurgeon explained quietly. "The little girl took her first steps last week. Her mother sent me a video right before my flight landed." He reached for his phone, which had been sitting on the security table, and showed them the video of a small child walking shakily into her mother's arms. The security guards watched the video in silence. The senior guard, who had been so stern earlier, removed his cap and held it against his chest. The younger guard couldn't stop staring at the floor, his cheeks burning with shame. A crowd of airport staff had gathered now too. Among them was an airport janitor who stepped forward, his eyes wet with tears. "That little girl, that was my niece," he said, his voice trembling. "I knew you looked familiar. You're the doctor who saved her. I clean the floors in this airport every night, and today I watched them treat you like a criminal." The businessman's face had turned so pale it was almost white. "I travel through this airport every week," he stammered. "I've probably walked past your niece's uncle 100 times without ever." He couldn't finish his sentence. Just then, the airport's chief of security pushed through the crowd, having been alerted to the situation. He took one look at the website on the nurse's phone, then at the distinguished doctor standing calmly amid the chaos, and his face fell. "Sir," he addressed the neurosurgeon, "I can't begin to express how deeply sorry we are. This should never have happened. Not to you, not to anyone." He turned to his team. "This is exactly why we need those bias training sessions we've been putting off." The neurosurgeon picked up his stethoscope from the table, the same one he'd used to listen to countless children's heartbeats before giving their parents news of hope. "You know," he said, "in medicine, we have a saying. The patient in front of you is the only one that matters. Not their background, not their appearance, just the human being needing help." He paused, looking at each face in the room. "Maybe that's what we all need to remember. The person in front of you is the only one that matters. Not what you think you see, not what you assume, but who they really are." The businessman stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "I have a daughter who wants to be a doctor. What do I tell her about what I did today?" The neurosurgeon smiled gently. "Tell her the truth. Tell her you made a mistake, learn from it, and will do better. That's how we improve in medicine, and that's how we improve in life." The young nurse was already sending the conference videos to the security team's emails. The airport staff were taking notes, determined to use this incident as a training example. Even the other travelers who had gathered to watch were quietly deleting their earlier social media posts that had jumped to conclusions. In just a few minutes, a simple misunderstanding at a baggage carousel had turned into a powerful lesson about prejudice, professionalism, and the importance of seeing people for who they really are. And though no one knew it yet, this was just the beginning of changes that would ripple through the entire airport system. The aftermath of the incident unfolded like ripples in a pond. The head of airport security was now standing in front of the neurosurgeon, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights as he delivered what might have been the most sincere apology of his 20-year career. "Sir," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "what happened today goes against everything we're supposed to stand for. We're here to keep people safe, not make them feel unsafe." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I don't want to just apologize. I want to learn from this." The neurosurgeon stood quietly, his presence commanding respect without saying a word. The same calm he maintained during complex surgeries now helped him navigate this delicate moment. Around him, people were still wiping away tears, especially after seeing the video of the janitor's niece taking her first steps after surgery. "You know," the neurosurgeon finally spoke, "in the operating room, we have something called a learning curve. Every mistake, every near miss becomes a teaching opportunity. Maybe this can be yours." His words carried no bitterness, only wisdom born from years of turning difficult situations into chances for growth. The businessman, who had been standing quietly with his identical suitcase, suddenly spoke up. "I need to make this right," he said, his voice shaking. "I travel through this airport every week. I've probably judged hundreds of people without even realizing it. I want to help change things." A young security officer stepped forward with a notepad. "Doctor, would you be willing to help us? We need to completely revise our training protocols. What happened today? It can't happen again." The crowd around them had grown larger, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What started as a scene of accusation had transformed into something like a town hall meeting, with people sharing their own experiences of being judged unfairly. An elderly lady in the crowd raised her hand. "I was a teacher for 40 years, she said. "We had to learn about unconscious bias in the classroom. Maybe airports need the same training." The neurosurgeon nodded thoughtfully. "In medicine, we learn that the first step to solving a problem is admitting it exists. Today, We've all seen this problem clearly. Now comes the harder part, fixing it. The head of security pulled out his business card. Doctor, would you consider being a consultant for our new training program? Your perspective as both a medical professional and someone who, he struggled to find the right words. Someone who knows what it's like to be judged by appearance rather than ability. The neurosurgeon finished for him, kindly. Yes, I'll help. But on one condition. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been wrongly profiled but didn't have a room full of doctors to speak up for them. The businessman stepped forward again, this time standing straighter. I want to help too. My company can provide funding for the training programs. It's the least I can do. A group of flight attendants who had gathered nearby began sharing stories of times they'd witnessed similar incidents but hadn't known how to intervene. The young nurse was already creating a group chat for everyone who wanted to be part of the change. The neurosurgeon looked at his watch. He was now hours late getting home. But sometimes he realized being in the right place at the wrong time could lead to something important. Just like in surgery, sometimes the unexpected complications lead to the biggest breakthroughs. Before I leave, he said, addressing everyone, I want you to remember something. Tomorrow, I'll go back to saving lives in the operating room. But today, together, we might have saved something just as important. We might have saved someone else from going through what happened here. The security team began taking notes as the neurosurgeon outlined basic principles they could implement immediately. The businessman listened intently, still holding his identical suitcase. A reminder of how easily assumptions can be wrong. And through it all, phones kept recording, capturing a moment when a simple mistake turned into a movement for change. The next morning, the video went viral. Someone had captured the entire incident, from the initial accusation to the powerful moment of revelation, and posted it online. Within hours, millions of people had watched, shared, and commented on the footage that showed more than just a case of mistaken identity. It showed how quickly prejudice can blind people to the truth. News vans gathered outside the airport, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. Reporters clutched microphones, eager to share the story of the renowned neurosurgeon who had turned a humiliating experience into a teachable moment. The video has sparked a nationwide conversation. One reporter announced, standing in front of the baggage claim area where it all happened. But what makes this story different is how it ended, not with anger, but with understanding. The young nurse who had spoken up had become an overnight hero herself. Morning shows wanted to interview her about the courage it took to step forward. I just couldn't stay quiet, she told them, her eyes still fierce with conviction. Sometimes doing the right thing means finding your voice when others are silent. Social media exploded with support. Medical students shared stories of how the neurosurgeon's research had inspired them. Parents of children he had operated on posted photos of their healthy kids, each one a testament to his skill and dedication. The hashtag see me note your assumptions started trending. The businessman, in an unexpected turn, appeared on a national news program. His voice trembled as he spoke about his mistake. I thought I was above prejudice, he admitted. I have a diverse team at work. I thought that made me enlightened. But yesterday taught me that bias can hide in places we don't want to look. Hospital staff from around the country began sharing their own experiences. A brilliant cardiac surgeon told of being mistaken for a janitor. An emergency room doctor described being asked to show ID multiple times while her colleagues walked freely through the halls. Each story added another piece to a puzzle that had been invisible to many. The airport's response went viral too. Instead of issuing a standard corporate apology, they announced immediate changes. Starting today, their statement read, every security officer will undergo enhanced training. But more importantly, we're creating a community advisory board to help us see our blind spots. The neurosurgeon watched all this unfold from his operating room, where he continued doing what he did best, saving lives. Between surgeries, He received messages from people around the world, but one stood out. It was from a young boy who wrote, "Yesterday, I wanted to be a doctor but thought I couldn't. Today, I know I can." Professional organizations began calling. They wanted the neurosurgeon to speak at conferences, not about medicine this time, but about changing hearts and minds. Airlines reached out, eager to review their own training procedures. Other airports started examining their security protocols. The janitor whose niece had been saved by the neurosurgeon became an unexpected voice in the conversation. "My niece can walk today because this man saw her as a child who needed help, not as a hopeless case," he said in a viral interview. That's the kind of vision we all need. But perhaps the most powerful response came from the medical community. Doctors and nurses across the country began wearing badges that read, "See the person, not the perception." It became a movement that spread beyond hospital walls, reminding everyone that snap judgments can have lasting consequences. The young nurse who had spoken up received hundreds of messages from other healthcare workers. "You showed us that being a medical professional means standing up for what's right, not just in the hospital, but everywhere," one wrote. By week's end, what had started as a terrible moment at an airport baggage claim had become a national conversation about seeing people for who they really are. And somewhere in an operating room, the neurosurgeon continued his work, knowing that sometimes the most important changes happen not in the brain, but in the heart. 6 weeks after the incident, the airport looked different. Not just in its physical appearance, with new training rooms and updated security protocols, but in the way people moved through it. The change was subtle but significant, like a shift in the air before rain. The security team had undergone a complete transformation. Every morning, they gathered for a brief session they called "Check Your Assumptions." They would review real-life scenarios, discuss better approaches, and remind themselves that their job was to keep people safe, not to make them feel unsafe. The businessman had kept his word. His company funded a comprehensive training program that was now being adopted by airports across the country. He himself had become a regular speaker, sharing his story as a warning about how easily bias can cloud judgment. "I used to think I was a good person who didn't judge others," he would tell the security teams during training. "But that day taught me that being good isn't enough. We have to be actively aware of our biases." His identical suitcase sat next to him during these talks, a powerful visual reminder of how easily assumptions can be wrong. The young nurse had been promoted to head of patient advocacy at her hospital. She had created a program called Speak Up, Stand Up, that taught medical professionals how to intervene when they witnessed discrimination. "That day at the airport," she would say, "I learned that staying silent is the same as being part of the problem." Airport staff noticed small but meaningful changes. The janitor whose niece had been saved by the neurosurgeon reported that people now looked him in the eye, asked about his family, treated him like a person rather than part of the background. "It's like everyone finally realized we're all just people," he said during a staff meeting. The security guard who had first confronted the neurosurgeon had undergone the biggest change. He now led sensitivity training sessions, starting each one by sharing his own story. "I thought I was protecting people," he would say, "but I was really just protecting my own prejudices." One day, a young traveler approached the security desk. She was nervous, clutching her passport tight. The same guard who had once been quick to judge now smiled warmly, took time to explain the process, made her feel at ease. Later, she wrote a letter to the airport praising the positive changes. The airport's new training center had a wall of quotes. At the center was one from the neurosurgeon. "In surgery, we have to see what's really there, not what we expect to see. Life should work the same way." Below it hung photos of the airport staff, security guards, janitors, baggage handlers, ticket agents, all sharing their stories of learning to see beyond first impressions. Other airports started sending their staff for training. What had begun as one airport's response to an embarrassing incident was becoming a model for change across the industry. Airlines adopted new policies, security companies revised their training manuals, and slowly, the culture began to shift. The businessman's daughter, who wanted to be a doctor, wrote a school essay about what she had learned from her father's mistake. "My dad taught me that it's okay to be wrong," she wrote, "as long as you're willing to learn and change." The essay won a national competition and was shared at airport training sessions. Regular travelers noticed the difference. The atmosphere at security checkpoints was more respectful. Staff were more patient, more understanding. The same cameras that had captured the incident now recorded countless small moments of kindness and professional courtesy. One afternoon, a new security guard asked the veteran who had been involved in the incident, "How do you know when you're doing it right?" The veteran thought for a moment before answering. "When you see people as people first, everything else becomes clearer." The changes weren't perfect. Change never is. But something fundamental had shifted. The airport had become a place where assumptions were questioned, where bias was challenged, and where everyone, from the cleaning staff to the CEO, understood that true security starts with seeing people for who they really are. 6 months to the day after the incident, the neurosurgeon returned to JFK Airport. This time, he wasn't just passing through. He had been invited to lead a special training session for airport staff. The same security guard who had once detained him now stood ready to introduce him to the packed room. The training room was filled to capacity. Airport staff from every department sat shoulder to shoulder, security officers, flight attendants, baggage handlers, and even executives in suits. Some had traveled from other airports across the country to hear him speak. In the front row sat the businessman, who never missed these sessions, his presence a testament to how one moment can change a life forever. 6 months ago, I stood in this airport as a suspected thief. The neurosurgeon began, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used in the operating room. Today, I stand here as your partner in change. But this isn't about me. It's about every person who walks through these doors. He shared stories from the hundreds of emails he'd received since that day. A grandmother who had been afraid to fly because of how she might be treated. A young professional who always arrived 3 hours early, anticipating extra security checks. A child who had asked their parents why some people got treated differently than others. The former head security guard, who had handled the incident that day, stood up to share his perspective. "I used to think good security meant being tough," he admitted. "Now I know it means being fair, being human, and being willing to question our own assumptions." During a break, the young nurse who had spoken up that day gave an impromptu speech. She had gone on to create a national network of healthcare workers committed to fighting discrimination in all its forms. "That day taught me that courage isn't just about saving lives in the hospital," she said. "Sometimes it's about speaking up when you see something wrong." The businessman's daughter was there too. She had just been accepted to medical school, inspired by both the neurosurgeon's medical achievements and his grace under pressure. "My dad's biggest mistake became my biggest lesson," she told the group, her father wiping tears from his eyes. The most moving moment came when the janitor's niece, the little girl whose life the neurosurgeon had saved, walked into the room. She didn't just walk, she ran, showing everyone how far she had come. The room erupted in applause, not just for her recovery, but for what she represented, the importance of seeing potential in everyone. The training session ended with a simple exercise. The neurosurgeon asked everyone to share one assumption they had challenged in themselves over the past 6 months. The stories poured out, personal revelations, small changes, moments of understanding. Each one added to the larger picture of real, lasting change. As the session wrapped up, an older security officer raised his hand. "Doctor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you could have sued us. You could have ruined careers. Instead, you chose to teach us. Why?" The neurosurgeon smiled. "In surgery, we don't just treat symptoms. We fix the underlying cause. What happened that day was a symptom. By working together, we're fixing the cause." He paused, looking around the room. And just like in medicine, the healing process takes time, patience, and commitment from everyone involved. The airport had changed its training manuals, its protocols, its procedures, but more importantly, it had changed its heart. The security guard who had once viewed difference with suspicion now taught others about the power of understanding. The businessmen who had jumped to conclusions now advocated for awareness. The young nurse who had found her voice continued to inspire others to use theirs. As the neurosurgeon packed up his presentation materials, he noticed something remarkable. The room didn't empty quickly. People lingered, talking in small groups, sharing stories, making connections. This wasn't just a training session anymore. It was a community coming together, committed to seeing each person who passed through their airport as exactly that, a person first. And somewhere in the busy terminal, a black suitcase rolled past on a baggage carousel, just another bag among many, reminding everyone that appearances never tell the whole story.